First of all, I want to thank Father McLean for the invitation to be here. I came in late in the process, and it's an honor and pleasure to be here. It's also an honor and pleasure to respond to the reflections of Professor Taylor, who's rightly honored widely and whose influence is also absolutely undeniable. He exhibits a thoughtfulness about perplexities often against the grain of many professional philosophers and what they might approve. And I don't need to say that he has made immense contributions to the issue of secularization and its complexities. Now, Professor Taylor did write a paper, and I received a copy of the paper, and I prepared some responses to the paper. So I could extemporize on his extemporization, and perhaps I will to some extent, but I thought first that I might just simply list some of the themes that I saw in the paper that he didn't read today. There were some brief paragraphs at the beginning on the theme of disenchantment and the immanent frame, a brief reference to the buffered self, which is something that interests me very deeply. Then the themes of bundling and unbundling that he outlined very much at the beginning of his presentation today. Throughout the paper, this contrast between, let's say, seekers and perhaps more conservative Catholics, and quite clearly he feels more comfortable with the side of the seekers. Now, the theme of authenticity is signaled in the title of the paper. Nothing was said about authenticity today, but there are some references to authenticity, and perhaps that should come back into consideration then also. There's a discussion of doubt, again, mentioned today. Interestingly, Keats's negative capability isn't mentioned in the paper, but that's an extremely rich formulation of the ability to remain in uncertainties, doubts, perplexities, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. A very pithy formulation by John Keats. The theme of the end of Christendom. And here again, throughout the paper, you find a kind of a double orientation. Something about the grandeur of Christendom and the misery, calling upon that motif of Pascal. But in all of the other themes that I've just outlined here, I think you'll find that doubleness. A movement in a particular direction, yet a certain generosity in understanding those who would not quite go in the same direction as he would go. But I think that what one finds overall is a feel for a finesse, let's say, again to use a Pascalian theme, for the ambiguities and equivocities of a situation, and a refusal to reduce those equivocities to any simple univocity. Now again, the end of the paper, and it's mentioned here today, takes, if you like, a more upbeat note in relation to the dissolution of Christendom, and that's where his employment of the metaphor of the mustard seed and the planting of seeds within a field of interconnections is detailed by him in the paper itself. Now, what I'd like to do is just to turn to the question of the porous self. Throughout the conference, on a number of occasions, some questioners have asked for something like a philosophical anthropology, something like a theological anthropology. So there's a certain sense in which my remarks, the ones that I want to offer here, and one part of my reflections, moves at a different angle in a certain sense. It's not looking at our situation in a sociological or a historical or simply in a hermeneutics of modernity, a re-narrating of its complexities, all very worthy tasks. I'm a metaphysician, and I'm an unrepentant metaphysician. Metaphysics has been in bad odor among professional philosophers to a large extent since Kant. And in the 20th century, in the continental tradition, you have Heidegger overcoming metaphysics, and connecting it also with ontotheology. So the fate of metaphysics and theology are very intimately interwoven with each other. In more analytical practices of philosophy, certainly at the beginning of the 20th century, there was this suspicion of metaphysics as, again, airy-fairy idealism. Though in analytic philosophy, it's very interesting that over the decades, metaphysics has insinuated itself back into the center of the discipline. Practiced not in the way that it can be in the longer continental tradition, but nevertheless, there are certainly signs today that metaphysics is making a kind of a comeback. So that very, very suggestive beginning of the secular age, that up to modernity, the self was a porous self. And it's part of Professor Taylor's hermeneutics of the movement from an enchanted to a disenchanted universe and the emergence of the buffered self. Now, this is an extemporization on that theme in a sense, namely, I think that you could make the case actually that there is not just a porous self in pre-modernity and then a buffered self, but to be at all is to be in a porosity of being. And hence there's some elemental and intimate porosity that marks the human being also. Now, I just want to say a few things about that, so bear with me, those of you who are of anti-metaphysical. So the notion of the porosity of being, and I'm wanting to, and this I hope to connect later with some remarks about Professor Taylor's themes and to bring it back to this notion of the kenotics at the end, just again so there is a kind of a connection between. So in a certain sense, there is a certain porosity of being, a more original given field of the between. This notion of the between is central in many books that I've written. So being, I see as a milieu of openness and communication, and we ourselves, as given to be, are an opening of being and an opening to being. So this sense of the porosity is ontologically constitutive, not just historically relative. Though it may be true that some epochs exhibit a feel for it, while others reconfigure the ethos of being and the human being, and the porosity is driven underground, so to say. In individual development, I think this porosity is more evident in the earlier stages of life. But a person always remains porous, potentially porous. And suffering and joy, as they happen to us, can keep it open. So just a few examples, again, to give you an indication of something that I'm talking about. The experience of listening to music. Sometimes we can be buffered selves. An air or a melody comes through an open window, and we're made porous. Something is opened out in us. We're transported. We're taken into a different space. By being made porous, we are, in a certain sense, more ourselves and more in communication with what is other to ourselves. Some of you are students of Kant, but Kant was a philosopher who, in my view, was irritated with this power of music to make us porous. There's a fascinating little footnote in the Third Critique where he gives out about the forced singing of hymns by convicts. Kant apparently lived close to a prison, and every Saturday the prisoners had to sing hymns. But they would intrude upon Kant's reflections, and he writes this footnote in Third Critique as a vengeance against their intrusion on his meditations. He uses the image actually of music as like a dandy who takes a perfumed handkerchief from his pocket, but the perfume spreads everywhere, and it affects everyone. But it doesn't ask in advance permission from our autonomous selves as to whether we want to be affected by the perfume or not. So this is a sense that the buffered Kantian self has no feel for the perfumes of being. Laughter is an example, again, a very elemental thing in human existence, where that porosity is opened again. Somebody cracks a joke, we break up. That's literally the language we use in English. I think that's the reopening of the porosity. Now, I think actually, to be pious in relation to our current situation, the deepest sense of porosity, I think, is evident in genuine prayer. And if we have experiences of meditation and religious communication, prayer is perhaps the most ultimate porosity in which the human being is in communication with the divine. And one could see liturgies, for example, as communal ways of keeping open or unclotted the porosity in an intimate and in a communal state between the human and the divine. So again, this porosity is almost nothing, but it is not nothing. Almost nothing and yet something. It's a place of passage, a threshold permeable to influence, openness to an otherness not of our own self-determination. So if I were to speak theologically, one could connect this porosity with the notion of creation. Out of nothing, something incontrovertible is there, and yet it is transient as time-bound and passing in the between. It's given to be, not giving itself to be. The notion of freedom here, I think, is also important because this is a theme that could be taken up in relation to the immanent frame. I would argue against the identification with freedom, of autonomy with freedom. We have a huge tendency in modernity to say freedom is univocally identical with autonomy. But I would argue for a variety of forms of freedom, but all forms of freedom in the end are endowed freedoms. That is to say, if they're endowed, there's a certain being given to be free in the first instance. That isn't a matter of our own autonomous self-determination. Okay, one or two ideas here that I think relate also to a modern reconfiguration of this sense of the porosity. And I would distinguish in relation to this what I call the passio essendi and the conatus essendi. Now, if you're familiar again with modern political thought in Hobbes or in Spinoza and after, the notion of the conatus essendi is identified often with our endeavor to be. So the striving of the human being to affirm itself, and without end, in fact, in the case of someone like Spinoza. But I try to argue that there is a passio essendi that is more primordial than this conatus essendi. And this patience of being, as I would put it, actually redefines the nature of our striving to be. The notion of autonomy is a form of freedom that emerges out of a particular configuration of the conatus essendi. And again, if one knows Kant and some of the other philosophers of autonomy, that sense of a heteronomy that's already given asks us to think of the matter quite differently. So would it not be, in a certain sense, a church of the what one might call the compassio essendi, where compassio is this patience with, indeed suffering with, but suffering doesn't always have to mean something painful. We suffer joy as much as pain. Something is given to us in an unpremeditated gift. So these are some remarks I offer in the spirit of the ecumenism of friendship, to borrow a very suggestive phrase from Professor Taylor. So thank you very much.